It's been too hot and sunny for the last few weeks. I haven't really wanted to record anything. Today it's actually relatively cool because it's been cloudy and a little rainy. So I thought I'd do a recording on how to get a plant that you've got from a big pot, kind of like this plant here. How do you get something that is this big to fit in something this small? This is a bonsai pot. You can tell in partly because it's fairly shallow. It also has two holes in the bottom for drainage. Holes are very important. If you want to have your own pot, you want to make sure that it's got holes in the bottom. When you put your bonsai into it, you're going to want to attach some screen material to the bottom. And I've got two recommendations there. One way to get screen material fairly cheaply would be if you've got like an old strainer, like a pasta strainer, you can potentially tear it apart and salvage the screen material that's in it because it doesn't rust, so it'll last you forever. And you can cut this into little squares. The other source that I've really relied on is buying a window screen material. So just the same black plastic stuff that you put in your window, buy a big sheet of it, it's super cheap. And then you've got a huge amount that you can just cut into little squares and stick them into the bottom of your pot. That helps you to keep the water able to flow out without washing out all your soil or potentially allowing certain insects to be able to climb up through the bottom. So that's why you want screen material. Now, when and how do you get your tree into this pot? Well, as I always say, it depends somewhat on the kind of tree that we're talking about here, because some tree species are going to be a little more finicky about how you get them into a pot. Some are going to be less. Oftentimes tropicals tend to be a lot easier to get into pots, like ficuses. Oftentimes I find that you can eliminate, heavily prune off the roots of those things, and they won't be too stressed by it. But in general, you want to be careful about pruning off large amounts of roots off of a tree because that puts a lot of stress and strain on the tree that it may not be able to recover from. So let me use one of the trees that I've got here as an example and show you what I'm talking about. This is an old holly bush that I dug out of someone's yard. You can see kind of why I wanted to hold on to it, I think, because it's got a really thick trunk at the base. Looks kind of interesting and gnarly, and I thought I might be able to turn this into a good bonsai. Now, this tree is something I just dug out a few weeks ago. In order to prepare it for digging out of the ground, I pruned back a lot of the foliage that was on it. I mean, I cut back like 80% of the foliage because I knew that I would probably dig up a lot of the roots. I would damage them in the process of digging out the tree. And if you cut off a lot of the roots but leave all of the foliage, then the roots may not be able to support all that foliage and the tree may die. So you want to cut off an amount of foliage that's sort of proportional to the amount of root material that you cut off. And so that's why I cut off a lot of foliage. Then I dug it out of the ground. Now it's sticking in this pot here. It seems to have adjusted okay. It's not looking like it's likely to die anytime soon. So I call that a successful transplant. What am I going to do about it from here? Well, I'm not going to put this into a smaller pot this year. Okay, it's already been through a very stressful experience this year, and it's going to need some time to adjust. Not only that, but it needs some time for its roots to grow back out and fill this pot that I put it in, this plastic pot. Over time, over the next year, it will regrow some nice, fine, fibrous roots, and that will put the root structure in a better shape for when I finally prune it all the way down and put it into the small pot. But the point is that I'm not going to mess with it anymore this year. I may do it next year. We'll just sort of see how it goes. But that's one thing to keep in mind. If it's something that you've just dug out of the ground or done something else really drastic to it this year, then I wouldn't mess with it anymore. Let me give you another example. This is a kind of cherry tree. This was a nursery tree. You can tell just by the shape of the root ball, it's been sitting in a pot forever. And this root ball is really dense and needs to be thinned out for sure. The question is when? When am I going to do this? I'm probably going to do it either in fall or maybe early spring of next year. And when I'm ready, I'm going to start by cutting off the roots by about 50%. Okay, I'm going to take a hacksaw probably and just slice it in half. Okay, that's not going to get small enough to fit into this tiny little pot. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to put it back into a big size plastic pot, stick it in there for another year, and then bring it back down to the ultimate size that I want it probably the following year. Why am I doing that? Well, because if I were to cut the roots off of this tree in order to get it to fit into that tiny little bonsai pot, it probably would not survive that process. I would have to cut off so much of the root system that it would be such a shock to the tree it might not survive. Part of the thing that kills the tree is that you wind up cutting off all of the nice fine fibrous feeder roots that the tree really needs to survive. So if you look at this tree in the bottom of it, it has these nice fine little white roots at the bottom, and if you were to look even closer, you'd see that they have little hairs all over them, and that is really what the tree relies on to bring up water and nutrients. The bigger roots, so like this kind of thicker root material here, this thicker root, this doesn't do much of anything. It's the tiny little roots at the bottom of it that are important. So if I were to cut off the fibrous roots but leave the big root, it's not really going to do much of anything for my tree anymore because there's no feeder roots attached to it. And if I do that throughout the entire root ball and cut off all of the feeder roots, then the tree may not survive. And so that's why, to be conservative and safe, I'm only going to cut off half the root ball, and that should preserve enough feeder roots in there somewhere that it can support the tree. What I may do is prune back some of the leaf material on the top just to again balance it out a little bit, and just in case I wind up cutting off too much root material for the tree to be able to support itself, by cutting off some of the leaves and branches, that may help balance out the difference so that there's less leaf material for the tree to support. What I would suggest is that if you cut off a lot of branch material from your tree before digging out of the ground or pruning a lot of the roots, do that several days at least before you do your major operation on the roots, so that it has time to seal over those wounds. Because when you cut off all of those branches, it's going to probably leak a lot of water, liquid material out of the branches, and you want the tree to be pretty healthy and have a good supply of water and nutrients in it when you dig it out of the ground or cut off all the roots. So after I cut off half of the root ball from that cherry tree, like I said, I'm going to wait a year, and then I'm going to come back to it and work on getting it even smaller. And then at that point what I'll do is I'll cut off as much of the roots as I need to in order to get it to fit into this pot. Okay, so when you're starting from larger material like that, it's probably a 2-year process to get it into a small pot like this. I know that sounds like a long time, but again, bonsai is not a hobby for the impatient. It's something that you have to be willing to put in the time into. And if you're in a rush, I'd find another hobby. Let's take a closer look at this purple leaf sand cherry here. When I'm getting ready to put this into a smaller pot, like I said, I'm going to cut the root ball about halfway down. But here's another little trick. As you get ready to pot it, you're going to want to get a sense of where the nabari is. And I've talked about the nabari before. The nabari is just the root flare of the tree, and it's a very valuable part of the tree from an aesthetic perspective. When you get these landscape trees, oftentimes what you'll find is that their potting material that they're in is sometimes inches above where the actual nabari is. In other words, the base of the trunk, where it starts to flare out into the roots, is sometimes buried under lots and lots of mulch and soil and actually other roots. Because oftentimes nurseries, they overpot things because they're going to sit in pots for years, and as a result the tree's roots can build up to the point where you can't see the real root flare. So what I'm doing here is I'm clearing out the top of the root ball here. I'm using a tool, just any tool will do, to scrape off the top, these roots that are way overgrown over the top of the nabari, and I'm removing the top soil so that I can get a sense for where the nabari is. This does a couple of things. This means that I'm better able to see what the real base of my tree is, where it will really be once it's in a bonsai pot. And it also helps me in the process of starting to get the tree ready for major root pruning, because I'm already starting to prune off some of these top roots, and because I'm doing this way ahead of time, I'm giving the tree some more time to heal from this little bit of damage that I'm doing, and that will make the process of potting it just a little bit less stressful. So getting this done out of the way kind of early is always a good idea. Helps you to know exactly what kind of a tree you're looking at here, what kind of a root system you've got, what kind of a trunk you've got, and helps to get the root ball a little bit more in shape for when you finally prune it down. So in this case, you can see that the trunk was actually buried under about this much of root and soil material. So I've exposed all this extra trunk here to my tree, and I can better see now where the nabari is. And it doesn't have much of a nabari. It's not a particularly impressive nabari, but that's the thing, is that you never know. And sometimes you uncover the top layer of roots here in a landscape tree, and you couldn't see them before, and as you uncover them, it's like a treasure hunt. It's like a discovery, and all of a sudden you look down and you see these big, interesting looking roots that are sticking out at the bottom sometimes, and you're like, wow, that's fantastic. And it's just a pleasant surprise. But it's always a gamble, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. One other thing I want to point out is that the decision to put your tree in a pot is a really important one, because once you prune all the roots off and make it just a very small root ball, your tree is going to slow down its growth dramatically, okay? So if you have a tree, a pre-bonsai that you're trying to get ready to make into a bonsai, you want to think about, okay, am I pretty much happy with where this tree is at in terms of its trunk thickness and basic size, or do I want it to get a lot bigger before I pot it? Because once I do that, the tree is going to have much less root material to work with, and so its growth rate is going to slow down tremendously. That's a potentially very desirable thing to have happen when you have a bonsai that is pretty much in the shape that you want it to be in, because slowing down the growth rate means that you don't have to do as much work to it. The leaves will stay smaller, they won't grow as long, the branches won't grow as long, as vigorously. It will stay more compact. the size that you basically want it to be in. But anyway, that's one of those factors that you also want to consider is, am I ready for this tree to slow down its growth yet? And if the answer is no, then maybe you want to leave it in a big pot or even bury it in the ground and just let it grow naturally for several more years and give it more time to really thicken up and become more mature, develop more character to it, and then maybe consider potting it. One other tip I give is that there's an important difference about deciduous trees and coniferous trees when you're talking about potting and putting them into a bonsai pot. Coniferous trees rely on a particular kind of fungus called mycorrhiza. And mycorrhiza is a white fungus that you can find growing in the roots of any pine tree. They need it to survive. It's not optional. It's also not anything that's hurting the tree. They actually have an interdependent relationship, the fungus and the tree. They need each other in order to survive. So pine tree needs mycorrhiza in order for it to live. And the reason why that's important is when you pot your pine tree, don't wash out all of the old soil when you get it ready to put into a new pot. You can add mycorrhiza later. You can actually buy this stuff, or you can salvage it from another pine tree that has some growing on it. But you have to plan for this in some way. The easiest thing to do is to just make sure that you don't wash out all the old soil before you prune it all down and put it in the pot. Make sure that some part of the root ball is left intact with the old soil intact, because that old soil will have some fungus in it that will be able to then grow and spread and fill into the rest of the pot. So that's really important, and that will make sure that your pine tree lives. And one final tip before I go, whatever you do, make sure that before you do your heavy pruning to get it into the pot, make sure that the root system looks healthy, okay? You know, I talked about cutting off half one year and then finishing it off the next year. It's possible you may need to wait even longer than that. Again, the goal is to make sure that the roots are looking full, fibrous, and healthy before you cut them all off and put them into the bonsai pot. And when I say make sure that the roots look healthy, what I mean by that is make sure that you've got some white tips growing at the ends of your roots. That's your clearest indicator that you've got living roots. They should have little white tips at the ends of them. If your roots don't have white tips, then probably the root is dead and worthless to you. So make sure that you've been doing a good job in previous months, watering it, feeding it, making sure that all the roots are growing and that it has plenty of nutrients to support it after you do that major operation, because it'll need some recovery time after that. You'll want to be extra careful with it for the next few weeks. Make sure that you keep it in the shade probably, or just some dappled sunlight. You probably don't want it to be in full blasting sun right after you do the heavy pruning and repotting. You want to kind of protect it. Make sure that it stays wet. Don't drench it every day, but make sure that the soil stays wet. And at that point, you should be pretty good. But again, this process may take more than 2 years, particularly if you've got a large starter material that's particularly larger than the stuff that I was just showing you. Again, the rule of thumb is to cut it down by half every season, and that's a fairly conservative approach that should apply to most species of trees. But again, some you can get away with being more aggressive and cutting off even more. So anyway, I hope this was all helpful. Let me know what you think.